Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this absolutely stunning Sunday afternoon. So for the next talk in our series for this year's PhotoIreland Festival, which is titled Bite the Hand That Feeds You. So we're talking about food, histories of food, philosophical considerations of food, and consumption. And today we are joined by a really interesting speaker, somebody I have admired from a distance and was fascinated by her research. So I'm super happy to be able to welcome Dorothy Cashman. I'm just going to read her bio for you briefly. Dorothy is a culinary historian and an independent researcher. Following her undergraduate degree at University College Dublin, she worked for Aer Lingus for 30 years and was awarded her doctorate in 2016 for her research on Irish culinary manuscripts. One of the founding members of the Dublin Gastronomy Symposium, her research interests include the history of the recipe in Ireland in both printed and manuscript forms, and the configuration of national identity as it interacts with Irish food history. She has presented in Ireland and at international symposia, and her research has been published in academic journals and edited collections. And today's talk is titled, At the Present Time, Gender, Class, Politics and the Cookbook in Ireland. The present time is referenced in a simple guide to Wholesome Diet, published by the Department of Local Government and Public Health during World War II. There are a multiplicity of present times, and a good place to observe them is through the medium of the recipe and its collected form, the cookbook. Irish cookbooks have been shaped in the first instance by the hegemonic influence of our nearest neighbour, and also arguably by the gendered ideologies of the Irish state post-independence. Taking the present time of the emergency as the starting point, this talk looks back to the origins of the cookbook in Ireland and forward to some of the most recent publications to see how they've been shaped by the times that they were written. So I would also like to remind everyone that the talk is being recorded and will be made available online to those who missed it. You're very welcome to use the chat room for comments or questions, which we can address afterwards. And if you prefer to speak, you can use the raise your hand feature to let us know after the presentation. So Dorothy, thank you so much, and I will let you take it away.
Thank you, Julia, and I'd like to thank you very much for asking me to talk and for being so pleasant to deal with. You suggested that we look at Irish cookbooks with politics, class and gender in mind, which of course I'm more than happy to do. And I hope that over the next half hour or so that I can show some evidence of having corralled my thoughts and the texts into some sort of coherent story. Because really cookbooks can take you in any number of directions and are increasingly being studied for the latent meaning folded inside them, either by close analysis of the individual recipes or by standing back and looking at them, taking what could be described as a more wide-angled view, to use an appropriate phrase. Today is less about individual recipes and more about that wide angle and what can be tracked through that. And given that this is part of an exhibition devoted to the voices of photographers, I apologize sincerely in advance for my lack of photographic skills in the images on the slides. Simple guide to wholesome health that I mentioned in the abstract for this talk is what I could suppose be best described as an information leaflet that was inserted in 1942 into an already existing government publication. It was inserted in direct response to the fear of food shortages and malnutrition here in Ireland during that period known as the emergency, a very particular present time in Irish history. And while I had originally planned on taking the emergency as the starting point today, when it came to putting it all together, it just seemed to me that those concerns of politics, class, and gender in cookbooks that you asked me to write about or to talk about emerge in a more coherent way if we look at it all chronologically. So starting at the beginning, in terms of Ireland, with a book published in 1767 by John Mitchell, printer of Skinner Row, now Christchurch Place, here in Dublin. And there it is, courtesy of the British copy in the British Library. There was a copy here in Ireland, but unfortunately the collection that it was part of went to auction a few years, and I don't know where it is now, it's disappeared. You can see that the copy in the British Library is very fragile, and the reference on the frontispiece there on the left, my left, to it being published by a lady isn't at all unusual. It follows a fairly standard convention of the time. But of importance for us is that the recipes are prefaced by that address in the centre, to the Ladies of Dublin and signed by an anonymous series. It's a small volume, smaller than the MacBook Air that I was working on beside that you can see the edge of there. The copy in the British Library is leather bound, and again, you can see how fragile it is there on the inside. It has 105 pages of recipes followed by an index and templates for suggested table layouts for different dinners in the à la Francais style of the period. Now, this little book raises a few issues in terms of its authenticity, which deserve explanation, an explanation which is inherently political in its outline. Firstly, publishers in Ireland up to the Act of Union in 1800 were not subject to the copyright rules that applied in England, Scotland, and Wales. This means that you get pirated versions of popular cookbooks republished here, often running to several editions. And this is, I believe, what must surely be the reason for the absence of local authors on the island in this period, combined with the fact that the audience for these books was Anglophone. Take Hannah Glass and her Art of Cookery Made Plain and Easy, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. Hannah's books were bestsellers for nearly 100 years, and she was really only knocked off her pedestal by Mrs. Beeton. Her Art of Cookery went to print in London in 1747. The following year, in 1748, it was republished here in Dublin by Ian J. Exshaw. Exshaw went back for 2 more bites of that free cherry with a changed title in 1753 and 1762. And then another publisher, W. Gilbert, republished the collection in 1791, 1796, and 1799, just before the law changed. Her book, Hannah's book, ran to 20 official editions, excluding those 6 pirated Dublin editions. But this collection by series doesn't seem to be a knockoff of an English collection, as no other published version of it exists as far as I'm aware. The other question is whether this is just a hodgepodge of plagiarized recipes put together by the publisher, John Mitchell, series, a fictional author, and the address to the Ladies of Dublin, just another ruse by Mitchell to appeal to the local market and sell books. These sorts of things happened. Take Mary Cole's Ladies' Complete Guide or Cookery and Confectionery in all their branches. This was published in London in 1788. Mary Cole describes herself as cook to the Earl of Drogheda, but the court is completely out on her bona fides. The bulk of the recipes in the book are recycled from other sources. In fairness, they are usually credited, so it's possible that this was simply a very clever money-making exercise in recycled recipes by the publisher. Cole, or whoever Cole is, says in the preface that if all the writers upon cookery had acknowledged from whence they took their recipes, as I do, they would have acted with more candour by the public. Their vanity to pass for authors instead of compilers has not added to their reputation, end of quote. It all sounds very authentic, or is it just a very clever double blind by the publisher? One of the authors that she cites is John Farley, which you can see, I think there, The Shoulder of Mutton Surprised. She cites him at the end of that there. He's best known for his London Art of Cookery, but he was one of the most notorious plagiarizers of the period. But we do at least know that Farley was a real person, a cook at the London Tavern. But we just simply don't know if Mary Cole was real. In itself, that could be a gender-related question. If Cole did actually exist and wasn't a published invention, there's a peculiar irony in the fact that she in turn had her entire book plagiarized by a Maximilian Hazelmore 6 years later in a book called Domestic Economy, or A Complete System of English Housekeeping. Again, it isn't known if he was a real person or a publisher's invention. So you can see it's all a very murky world, the cookbook world, with multiple layers of plagiarism and duplicity. And in the case of Ireland, with the added twist of opportunity for unauthorised reprinting of material up to the start of the 19th century in the Act of Union, politics with a capital P. Farley, Mason, and Raffald, which you can all see cited there by Cole on the slide, they all had editions of their books printed here in Dublin before 18. I don't think Verrell did. Back to Ceres, whether she's real or not, and she could be the wife or daughter of the publisher. I think I can say, in the absence of an edition published in Britain, that this is the first cookbook of Irish origin published here. Even saying of Irish origin is, I'm sure, opening another can of worms in everyone's head. What does that mean, of Irish origin? Because often what people expect to find when they use that phrase of Irish origin is something that they can identify as being uniquely Irish, if not in a political sense, then in a culinary sense. In my experience, this is a bit like looking for a culinary unicorn, especially in the context of written recipes, as opposed to recipes passed down in an oral context. Let me try to explain what I mean by using the example of recipes for Irish stew and the social and cultural burden that particular dish carries. One of the first talks that I gave was based on some of the culinary manuscripts held by the National Library of Ireland. Besides being repositories of actual recipes, as you'd expect, culinary manuscripts, which usually date from the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, carry lots of meanings, often personal to a particular family and their estate, a bit like a family Bible. For our purposes here, one of the salient characteristics of these handwritten collected recipes, certainly prior to the mid-19th century, is that they relate to a particular class in Ireland, the gentry or ascendancy, and discussion surrounding this class tends to focus on the Anglo-Irish and on the history of the big house and its inhabitants here. In 2013, TV3, following on from their very successful Tenements series, broadcast another documentary with precisely that title, The Big House, which followed 13 people who lived and worked as their ancestors would have done at Strokestown House in County Roscommon. One of the historians who took part in that documentary was Dermot Ferreter, a historian that we're all very familiar with. And what he had to say in one of the episodes, which at the time I took the bother of transcribing, articulates what is, I think, problematic for a lot of people about this historical source, even as it relates to our culinary history. What he says is that there is no collective attitude towards the big house. There are those who have a particular interest in the history of the big house, in the preservation of the big house, but there are also those who legitimately and quite rightly see the big house as a symbol of colonialism, of oppression, exploitation, of land stealing, and these are all important parts for history that have generated huge pain, huge anger, huge dispossession, and they will always be seen in this light, end quote. Now, my problem with this, I have a few issues with it, but what's really problematic is when culinary history gets added into the mix here. A very wise woman once said, and I quote her, "Food, climate, and people go together." When we talk about an Irish identity in food, we have such a thing, but we must remember that we belong to a geographical and culinary group with Wales, England, and Scotland, and we share their traditions as all countries share their traditions with their next door neighbour. That wise woman was Myrtle Allen, speaking at the opening of the Ballymaloe Cookery School back in 1983. I would add to Mrs. Allen's wise words that just as traditions are shared between neighbours, there's another factor, and that's the sharing or lack of sharing between social classes, social conditioning. So to go back to that talk in the National Library, as I recall, the first question asked at the end was whether there were recipes for Irish stew in the manuscripts. This can be an innocent question, or it can also be quite loaded or a political question. The first written recipe that I can source for Irish stew is in a collection of recipes published in 1798 by Eliza Melrose in her Economical and New Method of Cookery, as you can see there in the slide, describing upwards of 80, and the salient thing that she was writing about providing food to the poor. Melrose, who definitely was a real person, alludes to the formerly unscripted or oral history of Irish stew, when she says in her preface that the recipe had been put into the writer's hands by some ladies and gentlemen who are well-wishers to the work. It's one of a set of recipes that she gives, all for the purpose of feeding the poor, or which focus on potatoes, a vegetable that also had connotations of poverty. As you can see, the collection, I don't know that you can see it there now, collection was priced at 2 and 6 or 6 for 10 and 6 if purchased by clubs of the labouring poor or intended for their use. The earliest description of Irish stew, or its closest approximation preceding an actual written down identifiable recipe, goes back to 1674 and a satirical publication describing life on an imaginary island, Monte Capernia, generally taken as referring to Ireland, where a shipwrecked Englishman describes a meal that he had in the house of a poor, note the adjective, parson, with the following, quote, "Here was such beef, mutton, goats and kids' flesh, bacon, roots, etc., and all so confounded that the best palate could not read what he did eat. This hodgepodge proceeded from custom more than from curiosity, and this was one point of their husbandry, to boil all together to save charges." Note the close association with poverty in that the parson is described as poor and frugality is a hallmark of the stew's preparation. So given all of this, and given that Irish stew is simply a white stew that generally accrued very particular connotations relating to poverty up until the 20th century, you can see that to expect to find recipes for it in collections of the big house is a big ask. Given that, the presence or absence of recipes for Irish stew in these particular written sources that could largely be described as pertaining to the elite, can have several causes. It's simply not a simple issue. For example, recipes for Irish stew were arguably so well assimilated that you wouldn't really need to write it down. You just knew it. It was internalized as somatic reflex in the making of it. Or alternatively, it mightn't feature because it was viewed as being peasant fare, culturally inappropriate for elite dining, belonging to the other side of the social divide, definitely not for display on an elite table. Culinary history is at its best when it's complex, and the likelihood is that the presence or absence of Irish stew in the manuscripts was a combination of all of that. But here is one where it was present. In the 18th century Inchiquin collection, where there is a recipe to make an Irish stew of mutton, alongside a mess to feed 150 people and a receipt to feed the poor, which would suggest that at the Inchiquin table, at least, Irish stew was accorded some respect. And a very nice recipe it is, as you can see there, displaying a fine appreciation of the propensity of the floury Irish potato to break up. I could say lots more about Irish stew and history, but I'm going to use that present time that I used in the title to move us on into the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Because while it's obvious that our sociocultural awareness was being shaped by the wider political environment, what's less remarked upon in the context of identity formation is the influence of the domestic science home economics movement. And this is where the issue of gender and gender politics really rears its head in the context of cookbooks and the dissemination of recipe knowledge. Many of you will know All in the Cooking, a cookbook that very successfully crossed the divide between textbook and popular cookbook. It was first published by the Educational Company of Ireland back in 1946, with the fourth edition going to print in 1975. It was a 2-volume set, but the second volume, aimed more at the professionals, never achieved that iconic crossover status of the first volume, which infiltrates the public consciousness in a very particular way. Originally published as the official textbook of Coláiste the Weir Cookery School at Colbrua Street, now part of TU Dublin and about to relocate to Grange Gorman, such is this book's meaning to a whole generation of people that in 2016, O'Brien Press brought out a reprint of the third edition, with a new foreword written by Anne Brown, née Martin, one of the original authors, then in her 97th year. Professor Claire Wills points out that the original publication of this book in the immediate aftermath of World War II, again, that period we call the emergency, was part of a government strategy aimed at dealing with the problem of malnutrition in segments of the population. But the background to locating this public health strategy in the domestic was laid in 1937, 9 years before the publication of All in the Cooking, when the Free State Constitution of 1922 was replaced by Bunreacht na hÉireann, where, to paraphrase another historian, Tom Garvin, the ruling ideology was familial, and where the Constitution explicitly enjoined the state to foster the traditional patriarchal family with all that entailed in terms of gendered expectations for women and indeed for men. But let's just step back further and look at what I think of as All in the Cooking's lesser known cousin, Cookery Notes, where that simple guide to wholesome food found a home. Cookery Notes was published by the Department of Agriculture and Technical Instruction in what I now believe to be 1912, which is pushing it back beyond the previously accepted date of sometime around 1924. There's a scourge in cookbooks of not putting the date of publication in them. Whereas we know the authors of All in the Cooking, all we know about the authors of Cookery Notes is what it says in the cover, that these notes were originally prepared for use in schools and classes working under the schemes of the Department of Agriculture and Technical Instruction. This is the earliest extant copy of the notes that I have managed to source. While the specific authorship is vague, and I can't imagine that the same would apply to a scientific textbook of the period, there's one piece of information here which has allowed me to track the popularity of this collection and to establish that this was a collection, ephemeral in quality, that must have penetrated the consciousness of a significant percentage of the Irish population by the time it ceased publication. You can see there on both sides that it's the 60,000th run in 1924. By the time it was printed in 1951, the edition marks it as 186,000, not insubstantial. The last documented reference that I can find to it is in 1977, when it's referred to in a newspaper article as being purchased for 5p at the Government Publications Office in the GPO arcade, which I sadly remember. So on the go for some 64 years. At that stage, this is how it had changed, the cover had changed. This collection was never designed to survive, and patently thousands of them haven't. These are two of my favourites. The one on the right I found buried in an archive completely unrelated to anything culinary, and it's unfortunately missing the cover, so I don't know what year it is. It's worn to near death, as you can see. The one on the left from 1939, I think I actually screenshotted that from one that was for sale on eBay. Cookery Notes was translated into Irish in 1922 by the fledgling state, a statement in itself. In relation to its culinary content, the actual recipes, it doesn't run counter to the recipes in the standard textbooks that started to flood the market from the late 1880s through to the 20th century, of which All in the Cooking is one later example. These textbooks all had their impetus in the domestic science or home economics movements of the 19th century. And this is where I'm really conflicted and where the issue of gendered expectations becomes very live. As a food historian, never mind as a human being, it's obviously of great concern to me that people should be equipped with the basic skills necessary to feed themselves in a way that's both nutritious and enjoyable for them. And central to that is my belief that it's terribly important that we do not de-skill ourselves. And obviously central to this is the pedagogical role of the domestic science or home economics teacher. However, the origins and core beliefs of the domestic science movement are increasingly being seen as highly problematic in terms of women's history and defining their role in society. This applies to how it developed in the United States and in Great Britain and by extension Ireland, while acknowledging that there were cultural variations involved in each case. Now let's just look at Cookery Notes in this context. It was, as I said, commissioned by the Department of Agriculture and Technical Instruction, otherwise known as DATI, a department which shared control of public education on the island here with two other boards, which just needn't concern us here. As a government department, DATI controlled the technical and agricultural schools and 9 schools of rural domestic economy scattered over the country. It was also responsible for oversight of grant aid to the Irish Training School of Domestic Economy at Kilmacud, predecessor of Cathal Brugha Street. DATI was unusual as a department in the particular way it survived the foundation of the state. So it's worth noting that Cookery Notes started out life in one political jurisdiction and finished it well into the life cycle of another. It was also published at a time when there was widespread poverty amongst the working class, a class that was subjected to intense scrutiny, in particular working class women, who were castigated as being bad housekeepers at worst through their own fault and at best through ignorance. It was only when I read Professor Joanna Burke's research on the period from 1890 to 1914 that I could make sense of the incredible output of cookery books in that period whose authors were connected to the domestic science movement. There's one there that some people may be familiar with. Josephine Reddington is one example with her economic cookery book. When she first published that, she was head teacher at the Irish Training School of Domestic Economy in Kildare Street, moving over later to Kilmacud. Suddenly, all these books whose authors were connected to the domestic science movement made sense, because by then there was an industry in teaching housewifery, basic domestic skills, which included cookery and laundry. Effectively, the institutionalization of women within the home. In her research, Professor Burke documents how women moved or were moved out of the public sphere into the private sphere as the century turned, or to put it another way, how they were moved out of paid employment into the unpaid domestic sphere. It's really difficult to pinpoint the reason for this, but take as an example dairymaids and the making of butter, both for family consumption and the sale of what was surplus to the household requirement. What Professor Burke has to say about this is really illuminating, if not shocking. In her study, a statistical analysis of the employment of women from 1890 to 1914, she finds that as part of a larger technological revolution, men took over the milking of cows. And if women still performed this chore, it was recategorized as housework. I'm paraphrasing her slightly here. What she says is that, quote, if the milk was used merely for household consumption, women were more likely to milk as part of the housework. But with the advent of creameries, which regularized production and marketing, it was men who were increasingly likely to take over the process, end quote, relegating women further within the confines of the domestic environment. By 1900, cookery and laundry had become part of the school curriculum for girls. the downside of which was that there was less time devoted to other subjects. And I think we can all work out what that means. The cookery classes were particularly popular in rural areas, and according to DATI's third annual report, the policy was explicitly to train housewives and not domestic servants, paid labour, nor future teachers of domestic economy. Female labour came to be dominated by housework, in short, unwaged lives. The irony is not lost on me that this whole process was predicated on a subset of women becoming professionalised in order to facilitate it. But given that these women were employed by the state in the main, they too were stymied in that the marriage bar effectively removed a large proportion of them from public view at what should have been the height of their career. There's so much more that could be said about this intersection of the home economics movement, and to be honest, I'm still working my way through it. But how it intersects with Irish culinary history and the history of cookbooks is where I started. But it does explain the fact that in that period, up to the emergence of the names that we're all familiar with probably, Maura Laverty, Monica Sheridan, Theodore Fitzgibbon, and Monica Nevin, to name but a few, the women trained in the domestic economy sphere were the repository of recipe knowledge. With that little collection, Cookery Notes, virtually anonymous as it was, travelling to the four corners of the island over a prolonged period of time. If what I've looked at so far could be seen as case studies of different present times, this last one brings us up to and beyond the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, and an unlikely product of the negotiations surrounding it. On the 7th of August 2018, the Guardian newspaper published an editorial commenting on the announcement by Gerry Adams that he was publishing a cookbook for Christmas that year. The former Sinn Féin president had announced this at an event in West Belfast the previous night, as reported by Noel McAdam for the Irish Times that day with the headline, I cringe, Cookie Our Law, Gerry Adams to publish book of recipes. He quoted Adams as saying that, open quote, the British never fed us. They never had any food. But as intrepid Republicans and being blessed by one or two great cooks, these are the recipes that sustained the Irish negotiating team. It contains some of the best kept secrets of the Irish peace process. In February of 2019, the published book was reviewed in the Irish Times by Tommy McKerney, a former volunteer in the Provisional IRA, who had taken part in the 1980 hunger strike, then and now working as a freelance journalist. McKerney's review could be taken as a case study for culinary historians in itself, commenting as he does that, quote, the veteran Republican, Adams he means, offers his reader a range of basic recipes more often found in a first-year home economics primer. Questioning, and he goes on to question whether many homes in Ireland need to be reminded of the ingredients required or how they were prepared. I think he's being a bit optimistic there. More astutely, McKerney looks to the reasons behind the publication, quickly discounting the overtly financial, as the book retails for a very modest price and is only available directly from Sinn Féin, which is where I got my copy from. While ostensibly the background to the project was the party's experience of the negotiations which led to the Good Friday Agreement, hence the title, and the inability, as stated by Adams, of the Downing Street negotiating team to provide proper sustenance, McKerney points to a possible different impetus for the book in the then ongoing Brexit negotiations, and what he describes, and what is still unfolding, as we can see day by day, as the fragile situation north of the border. What McKerney concludes is that Sinn Féin are standing by with their previously honed negotiating skills to enter the fray again. The book serves as a reminder. The truth otherwise of the reviewer's thesis, if I'd read it correctly, is not for me to say. But as a culinary historian, I find the book absolutely fascinating on so many different levels, only one of which I'll touch on here, and that's the whole area of diplomatic dining. Elaine Mahon of TU Dublin was recently awarded her doctorate for a riveting thesis on Irish diplomatic dining from 1922 to 1963, from the establishment of the Free State to the state visit of President Kennedy. Her research establishes just how the fledgling state set about entertaining its important guests and how it established protocols surrounding culinary diplomacy. It's a research topic that's endlessly fascinating, particularly so because it's so very live for us. You can see it unfolding as spectators on a daily basis on our TV screens, with coverage of political events such as the recent G7 summit in Cornwall, where, as widely reported, the leaders from 7 countries dined on turbot caught off the Cornish coast, Cornish new potatoes, local greens, and wild garlic pesto, finishing with a selection of Cornish cheese and English strawberry pavlova. Last week, a paper was presented at the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery on the importance of food and drink as diplomatic gift by Paul Brummel, former UK ambassador to Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and Romania. In a panel where another fascinating paper looked at cookbooks of the communist era in Romania as propaganda tools, arguing that they were intended to project the false image of a modern and well-provided for society comparable to any Western capitalist one, while also serving as pretexts for daydreaming and learning for food-deprived people. So you can see why the Adams Cookbook is particularly interesting to me on so many different levels, not least the commentary surrounding it. Adams is going behind the normal diplomatic exchange of gifts and entering right inside the negotiating chambers, reshaping that old adage attributed to both Napoleon and Frederick the Great, that an army or a negotiating team marches or fails to march on its stomach. But to sum up, I suppose what I'm trying to convey here, prompted by Julia's questions, is never underestimate the cookbook as a source. And to go back to Irish stew, which surprisingly doesn't feature in the Adams Cookbook, just look at the journey it has had, from those early associations with poverty and making do, through to this, a very superior version as created by Ross Lewis of the Michelin-starred Chapter 1 for Unpost, one of 2 images depicting Irish cuisine to mark the 2005 European Year of Gastronomy. The other one was native oysters. Eliza Melrow would be truly astonished. So from the anonymous series, the equally anonymous compilers of Cookery Notes, the more confident named authors of All in the Cooking, through to the negotiator's cookbook, each book and author speaking to a very particular present time. A present time capable of being understood in a very particular way with that trusty old manual by your side, the cookbook. That's it.
That's brilliant, Dorothy. Thank you so much. That's so interesting. At one point, I actually had to grab a piece of paper and start taking notes.
I could see you.
Yeah.
She's cooking up hard questions.
No, I didn't. I suppose I don't have any questions, but no, I was taking down so many notes because there's just so many interesting strands that you kind of took us on, you know. Thank you so much. It's absolutely fascinating. Yeah, and I'm curious, just from my own curiosity, those stamps that you have, the stamp there.
Yeah.
Sorry, what did you say? This 2005.
2005, yeah. Yeah, European Year of Gastronomy. I have that stamp actually courtesy of Morchin McAnumra because I was actually going to use it in the paper that I was submitting. Yeah, 2005 European Year of Gastronomy.
Yeah, I'd love to see more of them. I'll have a look. I'll do my research.
I couldn't find it online. If you need it, email me. I'll send it to you.
I know. I'm just curious, I suppose. And you said there's 2 of them, did you?
Yes, the other stamp was the native oyster.
Right. Lovely. Okay. I mean, yeah, thank you so much. I think it was a really brilliant, fascinating journey that you took us on. Also because when you mentioned the outline of the talk, I was really, really interested in the Jerry Adams story, the cookbook, but I wasn't sure how, I wasn't sure how it kind of related to the
where it was going to go.
Yeah, but it was just it's brilliant. Thank you. I don't know if anybody has any questions or any comments. You're super welcome to speak or to put it in the chat room. I guess my my interest, I suppose, now is to kind of I'd love to kind of find out more about the I suppose how the gender roles are now in Irish cooking. Sorry, I don't have my question phrased in my head, but I'd love to kind of find out more about how this translated into into just modern day kitchens. And also you were talking about home economics, for example, and I mean, I remember obviously I did home economics in school, but I have 2 brothers who didn't have that as an option even in their school, and that's only that's not that long ago, you know. But Orla Fitzpatrick has a question. Does Dorothy know when photographs were first used in Irish cookery books?
I'll find out for you. I can look back, certainly. It's not hard. It wouldn't be hard to figure out. There's photographs in Full and Plenty in Moral Laverty's one, certainly. So I'd have to work back from that.
Yeah. And Mary is wondering, thank you so much for such an interesting talk. Where can I find out more about the move from paid to unpaid work, especially dairy maids? Thank you.
I would start with Joanna Burke's book, which is hard to get if you Google her. It's one that she did a good while ago. It was that really, because I had started by, I was working out the history of Irish cookbooks, and I just could not quite get my head around the fact that there was this sort of explosion in books by domestic science teachers, home economics teachers, you know, the kind of fluid, the terms in England, which, you know, the United Kingdom, which we were of course part of up to that period, and how many Irish women were going over to train in English cookery schools. It just was a whole world that opened up in front of me, which I'm still researching, and it's a tricky enough one to research. So I've forgotten what the question was. What was the question?
Where to find out more about the move?
Oh, yes, go to Joanna Burke's book. She's an economic historian, I think, primarily. And her question was, why did women disappear from paid employment? Where did they disappear to? And funnily enough, I was, at the time that I was reading that, I was researching the account books of the friars. I was researching them based for culinary history details, but I was very struck in the early ones, so prior to the late 1700s, up to about 1780, I was really struck by the amount of women who were employed. So suddenly I could see exactly what Joanna Burke was saying. They fall off a cliff in terms of employment and paid employment at a certain period. And she is trying to understand that. I think, if I remember correctly, she doesn't come to a conclusion, but she can track it happening. She doesn't come to a firm conclusion as to why it happened. It's complicated, but there certainly was a push to put women inside the home until, of course, wars broke out and they needed to be taken out again and dusted off. But there certainly was a movement. I'm sure if you read feminist historians as well, they will back up why that was happening. They probably give different reasons than Joanna, because she's coming at it more from an economic perspective.
And I think Adrian Harrington there has raised her hand. So Adrian, you can go ahead and ask your question or comment.
Thanks a million. That was great, Dorothy. Thanks a million. And my question was too long to write it in the chat. I'm just interested in the going back to the 1700s, and some of the cookbooks that you're talking about there are, I suppose, there is as much improvement literature as anything else, in that they're, I suppose, geared towards the poor. Was that the genesis of cookery books back then, or were there different perspectives or different movements at the time?
Again, it's not simple. There were some that were there. I think the ones sort of aimed at the poor were later. The earlier ones were, you've coffee table ones, like Charles Carter's ones are essentially coffee table ones with the most incredible plates in them and everything like that. So you have those really, you know, expensive ones. Mm-hmm. And then it became a mass market. And I think Gillian Lehman would say, you know, that they gradually slid down the social scale.
Okay.
You know, you could do a study about where they are, and they're accommodated now on all sorts of different scales. There's the coffee table one, and the charity ones. So they're really, you know, they don't fall into any really neat categories.
Okay.
The ones aimed at the poor would be later than the original ones.
All right. Okay. And what's the earliest cookbooks then in Ireland that you've come across?
Well, that one series.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think there's the copy in the British Library, and there's the copy that was here that was sold. Mm-hmm. So, like, that's how fragile our connection is with an early printed copy. And I really, you know, the fact that it says "To the Ladies of Dublin," the fact that there's no other reprint of it anywhere else, to me, it looks like it is written by a printer here, or his wife, or whoever Ceres was. I mean, it is a really murky world. Like Barbara Ketchum-Wheaton would have always said that. And, you know, there've been great papers in PPC about the plagiarism and the shenanigans that went on. No, down to sure they still do. I mean, we all know publishers cook up some cookbooks still that, you know, you'd wonder, you'd question where all the recipes came from.
That's great. Thanks a million for that.
And Catherine Santoro was just wondering if we clarified the title of Joanna's book. Is this, I just have to Google, is it Husband?
Yeah, I'll have to Google it myself. I've tried to, because I had to borrow it and take notes from it, and I've never been able to get a copy since. So that's why it doesn't come tripping off my head. I'm not looking at it.
Well, is it Husbandry to Housewifery?
Yes, that's it. Yeah.
Change housework in Ireland. Yeah. I'll put it in the chat there for Catherine. Sorry, now I'm typing for everybody to hear. But I think that was really fascinating, and I'm looking forward to just having a kind of.
Yes, in fact, there's another book out recently by Patrick Walsh about the cooperative movement, and I was he references sort of, you know, the fact the cooperative movement was particularly cruel to women. It moved them again out of what things that they had been doing, and the sort of the mechanization of the whole system was taken over by men, and women, you know, were pushed out of the traditional things that they had used to make, you know, to earn money in the home and everything like that. So Patrick Walsh as well, his recent book is good on it.
Patrick Walsh.
Yeah, and I can't remember the book's inside. I can't remember. The cooperative movement, I think it's called. Something cooperative in the title, I'd say.
Yeah, I wonder how much of that is so.
I know he was interviewed on the Field Day podcast, I think before me, because I remember. So if you go on to the Field Day podcast, his podcast is very interesting as well about it.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. I'm really I'm just going to be thinking about this now for the next few days. I might end up emailing you with my own questions.
You can come back to me.
I'll probably will. Thank you. No, it's just such a huge field. I mean, of course, that's your field of study. But yeah, I think sometimes we don't really realize how many layers and how political it is. Yeah, so I just want to say, yeah, thank you again for speaking to us about this.
Pleasure.
And I'm just
made me think.
I'm absolutely fascinated, really. I think before we go, maybe I can just bring everyone's attention to next week's events that you can also book and register for. I can put the links in the chat in a second. I think of particular interest, perhaps, to our current audience would be the live interactive event with the Center for Genomic Gastronomy. They're exploring the concept of the national dish. And there is a reading group coming up as well with artist Ksenia Yurkova and curator Karina Apostol on the food as a structural unit of politics, transmitter of memory, and matter of art. And yeah, I suppose I don't want to finish without saying thank you to the festival supporters. This year we've been kindly supported by the Arts Council of Ireland, Dublin City Council, and the Office of Public Works. And of course, a very special thank you to everybody who's here, and also to Dorothy. A very big thank you to Dorothy. Yeah, I'm just really feeling very motivated to find out more and to really dig in. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you. Thank you.